A sealed cave in the desert, tens of thousands of manuscripts, lost in the dark for almost 1,000 years. A monk with a key, and a stranger who walks back out carrying the oldest dated printed book on Earth. His name? Aurel Stein. The place? Dunhuang. To some, he was the greatest archaeologist of his age, the man who pulled the buried kingdoms of the Silk Road back out of the sand. To others, he was its greatest plunderer, the foreigner who crated up China's treasures and shipped them off to London and Delhi. Both verdicts describe the same man, Mark Aurel Stein. Born in Budapest, a British scholar in India, brought more of the ancient Silk Road to light between 1900 and 1916 than anyone before him. And a century on, two nations still argue over whether what he did was rescue or robbery. He was born on the 26th of November, 1862, in Budapest, Stein, Mark Aurel, into a Jewish family that had its children baptized to keep every door in the Habsburg Empire open to them. His was an upbringing of languages and discipline, Greek and Latin first, then Sanskrit, Persian, Old Persian. He studied at Vienna, Leipzig, and Tübingen, and took his doctorate before he was 21. And in the army in Budapest, he learned a craft that would matter as much as any dead language: surveying, how to map a landscape, how to read a country as a web of lines and elevations. In 1888, he sailed for British India, to Lahore, a scholar in the service of empire. But a desk was never going to hold him. One idea drove him. 12 centuries before, a Chinese monk had crossed these same deserts. Xuanzang, the pilgrim who carried hundreds of Buddhist scriptures home from India and left behind a meticulous record of the road. Stein read that record like a guidebook. Where Xuanzang had described thriving kingdoms, there was now only sand, and Stein was certain that under it lay whole cities, freeze-dried by the dry air and forgotten by the world. All he needed was a patron, and he found one at the very top of British India. The Viceroy, Lord Curzon, gave the venture his blessing. In 1900, Stein set out on his first expedition into the deadliest desert in Asia. His road led over the passes into Chinese Turkestan to the oasis towns of Kashgar and Khotan. Before them lay the Taklamakan, a sea of sand the size of Germany, one of the driest deserts on Earth. The caravan men said its name meant, "Go in and you do not come out." That was exactly where Stein wanted to go, because the dryness that kills everything here had also preserved everything. Under the sand, it guarded what would long ago have crumbled anywhere else. What he found outran every hope. At Dandan Oilik and Nia, whole towns the sand had swallowed, he lifted temples, houses, and writing tablets out of the ground. Wood, ink, even fruit, 15 centuries old, and yet preserved as if dropped only yesterday. As on every journey, he was accompanied by a small fox terrier named Dash. It would not be the last. All his life, Stein led a succession of little dogs of the same name across Asia. On his second expedition, Stein pushed deeper still, to a lost city on the dried-up lake of Lop Nor, Lolan. But another man had been there first. The Swede Sven Hedin, the great rival of desert exploration, had found Lolan years earlier. Between the two, there was no personal bond, only the same blank space on the map, and the quiet race to be the one who filled it. Further south, in the ruins of Muran, Stein made a discovery that seemed to belong to another world. Wall paintings of winged figures, almost like angels, in a style that ran all the way from the Greco-Roman world to India. A small inscription even named the painter. Here, in the middle of Asia, the visual languages of two continents met on a single wall, proof of how far the Silk Road once carried art and faith. In 1907, Stein reached the goal of his journey, Dunhuang, an oasis on the desert's edge, and before it, a cliff full of wonders. In the Mogao Caves, the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas, monks had cut hundreds of grottos into the rock over 1,000 years and filled them with paintings and statues, a whole museum of Buddhism carved into a cliff face. Watching over the caves was a man no one had appointed, Wang Yuanlu, a wandering Daoist priest who had made himself the site's guardian and begged alms for its upkeep. 7 years earlier, behind a painted wall, he had found a sealed chamber, a small cave packed to the ceiling with manuscripts, walled up around the year 1000 and forgotten ever since. The Library Cave of Dunhuang. What lay behind the wall defied belief. Tens of thousands of scrolls, stacked floor to ceiling. Buddhist sutras, contracts, letters, paintings, texts in a dozen languages. The greatest archive of medieval Asia, sealed in the dark for almost 1,000 years. Stein stood before it and knew at once this was the find of his life. Only one question remained: how to get his hands on it. Stein had a problem. He could not read Chinese. His key to Wang was someone else, his secretary, Jiang Shaowan, who translated and smoothed the way. And Stein had a second card to play, his devotion to Xuanzang. When he told the pious guardian that he was following the very pilgrim Wang himself revered, the suspicion began to thaw. Night after night, Wang quietly carried bundles out of the chamber and into Stein's tent. In the end, they came to terms. For a donation to the temple, around 130 pounds in silver, Wang let the stranger take 24 cases of manuscripts and 5 more of paintings and embroideries. To Wang, the money went towards saving his caves. To us, it marks the moment the greater part of a Chinese national treasure left the country for good. Both of those things are true. Among the thousands of scrolls was one whose value only fully emerged later. At its end, it carries a date, the 11th of May, 868. It is the Diamond Sutra, the oldest dated printed book in the world, printed from carved wooden blocks 6 centuries before Gutenberg. Stein carried it away without being able to read a word of it. Today, it rests in London. The triumph came at a price. On the way back, Stein pushed his surveys into the high Kunlun Mountains along the southern rim of the desert, over passes above 5,000 meters. There, in the late summer of 1908, the column was caught by an early winter. For days it fought through snow and biting cold, the altitude dragging at every breath. Stein froze the toes of his right foot. They had to be amputated. And yet, before the bandages were even set, he was already planning the next stage. The man whom neither sand nor ice could quite stop would go on crossing Asia, 1 foot lighter and as restlessly curious as ever. A few months after Stein, a second man reached the Library Cave, the young French sinologist Paul Pelliot, and he had what Stein lacked. He read Chinese fluently. For 3 weeks, Pelliot sat by candlelight in the chamber, checking scroll after scroll, up to 1,000 a day. Where Stein had to reach for quantity, Pelliot chose with a connoisseur's eye. Pelliot took the rarest pieces back to Paris, the dated, the unique, the ones a scholar recognizes at a glance. What stayed in the cave was later moved to Beijing, and much of it vanished on the way. And so the greatest library of old Asia was scattered across half the world, to London and Paris, later to St. Petersburg, Tokyo, and Beijing. Only a century later would anyone begin, at least digitally, to put it back together. Stein and Pelliot were not alone. A quiet race between the great powers had broken out over the treasures of the Silk Road. From Germany, Albert von Lecoq traveled to Turfan and carried home whole walls of paintings, sawn straight out of the temples of Bezeklik. From Russia, Japan, and later America came more expeditions. Each wanted its share before another could take it. Lecoq's haul went to Berlin, and with it a bitter irony. Many of the finest paintings, fixed firmly into the museum walls and therefore impossible to move, were destroyed by bombs in the Second World War. What Stein carried to London survived. Part of what Lecoq brought to Berlin was lost forever. The argument that removal is also rescue cuts both ways. The American Langdon Warner went furthest of all. In 1924, he returned to Dunhuang and used a chemical to strip whole sections of the wall paintings from the cave walls, badly damaging them in the process. For many in China, this was the point where research turned into open theft. The patience of an entire country had run out. In Europe, Stein became a celebrated man. In 1912, the king knighted him, Sir Aurel Stein, from then on. In vast works like Ruins of Desert Cathay and the 5-volume Sarandia, he laid his finds before the world in exhaustive detail. No expedition of his age was ever documented so completely. Yet Stein's quietest achievement was not the treasures, but the maps. On his journeys, he surveyed tens of thousands of square miles of previously blank chart, geographic work that would outlast generations. It was backed by patrons like Lord Curzon, the former viceroy, and by the Royal Geographical Society in London, which honored Stein with its highest awards. The celebrated explorer remained a solitary man. Stein never married. Home, for him, was a tent on a mountain meadow and a handful of loyal friends, above all Fred Andrews, who ordered and preserved. At his side, always, a fox terrier named Dash. His finds, though, were divided. Part went to London, part to Delhi. Even in his lifetime, his life's work split into 2 collections on 2 continents. In 1930, Stein set out once more on a 4th expedition. But China had become a different country, a young nation-state, no longer willing to let its past be carried away, passed an antiquities law and stopped him. Overnight, the celebrated scholar had become an unwelcome plunderer. The age in which foreigners packed Asia's treasures into crates was over. To this day, 2 views collide. In China, Stein is the man who stole a national treasure and took advantage of a simple guardian's trust. In the West, he was long seen as a rescuer who saved the manuscripts from decay and war, cataloged, studied, and today, through the International Dunhuang Project, digitally reunited. Yet the case of Lecoq is a warning. Removal was not always rescue, and no archive can replace the lost context of the place it was torn from. One dream, though, was denied him all his life: Afghanistan, the land of Alexander, which he was never allowed to enter. Only at the age of 80, in 1943, did permission finally come. Ill but overjoyed, Stein traveled to Kabul, to the end of a longing 50 years in the making. A few days after his arrival, Stein suffered a stroke. On the 26th of October, 1943, he died in Kabul, 80 years old, on the threshold of the adventure he had wanted most. They buried him there, in the city's Christian cemetery, far from the deserts that had made him famous. But his legacy stayed divided, like his collection, the greatest explorer of the Silk Road, and to a whole country, the man who took it from them. Both carry the same name, Aurel Stein.